Forward Guidance is brought to you by VanEck, a global leader in asset management since 1955. You'll be hearing more about a VanEck ETF later on, but for now, let's get into today's interview. I'm very pleased to welcome back to Forward Guidance Michael Pettis, professor of finance at the Guangha School of Management at Peking University and senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. When Michael and I spoke a year ago, Michael expressed his concerns about the Chinese economy and, in particular, its investment driven growth model. Since then, the Chinese economy has continued to struggle. We have real estate sales, commercial real estate sales down 25%, and the Chinese economy in the second quarter grew 4.7%, which sounds high, but for China, it's really not that high. It is quite a low level of growth. So I'm very pleased to speak to the professor once again. Professor, welcome back to Forward Guidance. Can you just start us off? What have we missed over the past year since we spoke last in the Chinese economy? And how has it accorded with your views on the Chinese investment-driven growth model and the weaknesses there, which I'd love for you to elaborate on? Thank you.
As we discussed, Jack, the problem with the investment-driven growth model, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it, but it makes a big difference whether your economy is seriously underinvested, which China was in the 80s and 90s, or whether it's no longer underinvested, in which case very high investment rates are increasingly likely to result in non-productive investment, in which case you should see debt starting to grow much faster than GDP. And as we discussed last time, that's been happening for quite a long time. You could argue that that's been happening since 2007, 2008. What's changed in recent years is that there is a much greater recognition of what the problems are, what the imbalances are, and what the consequences are. So in 2021, that was a very important year because after years of this rising real estate prices, frankly, a bubble, one in which Beijing had tried many times to rein in, but as the cost of reining it in became clear, they always backed away. But finally, in 2021, they didn't back away, and they put a serious constraint on continued growth in the real estate sector. That happened very late, but it was necessary. It was good that they did it and didn't postpone it any longer. But there is a big problem because the real estate sector accounted for roughly 1/3 of the total investment in the Chinese economy. And remember, what characterizes the Chinese economy is that it's disproportionately driven by investment. So, globally, investment is about 25% of GDP and consumption is about 75%. It varies a bit, but it's been pretty steady at that rate during the century. Not all countries have the same levels of investment. Low investing countries, which tend to be advanced economies or slowly growing developing economies, tend to invest 18, 19, 20% of GDP, and high investment economies, which tend to be very rapidly growing developing countries, tend to invest around 32, 33% of GDP. Well, in China, investment is 43% of GDP, and it used to be as high as 47% of GDP. This is really unprecedented number. So what that meant is that investment far more than consumption was driving growth, which is what we discussed last time. And so as investment became increasingly non-productive, including in the property sector, you had to rein it in. But there was always a big problem. When investment is such an important driver of growth and you rein in investment, then one of two things must happen. Either consumption growth must pick up speed, very unlikely when you're reining in investment, or GDP growth must drop. And so China was facing a problem. They were trying to rein in investment in the property sector, and they were becoming increasingly worried about investment in infrastructure. I mentioned 2021 is when they reined in the property sector. 2022 is when we started getting the first formal recognition that many of the provinces, in fact, most of them, are effectively bankrupt, unable to service their debt without help. So they were trying to slow down the investment in infrastructure that was generating all of this local government debt. But then they faced the problem. If you slow down investment, then you need consumption to surge, or else GDP growth drops. And what they decided to do was to shift all of this investment out of the property sector and into manufacturing. Now, this seemed like a good strategy, but there was a big problem with that, and that is that China is 17% of the world. It accounts for only 13% of global consumption, but it accounts for 31% of global manufacturing. And by shifting investment out of property and into the manufacturing sector, that implicitly meant that the Chinese share of global manufacturing was going to grow relative to its share of global GDP, and even more so relative to its share of global consumption. Now, if China were a small country, that would be fine. Most people wouldn't notice it. But when you're the second largest economy in the world, at 17% of global GDP, that kind of shift requires a pretty severe accommodation from the rest of the world. And that means the rest of the world has to agree to reduce its manufacturing share and increase its consumption share in order to accommodate China. Now, if the rest of the world had been very friendly, they wouldn't have done that. The fact that we're in a very unfriendly world made it even clearer that that wasn't going to happen. So what we've seen in China is that the manufacturing share has grown, and that's shown up in the form of a growing trade surplus, which the rest of the world must absorb, but is increasingly unlikely to do so. So the problems we talked about the last time I were here have all, as expected, been exacerbated, gotten worse. Growth continues high, but it's really driven by excess investment and larger trade surpluses. And the consumption side of growth continues to contract. So China is facing worse imbalances than ever, and very difficult choices in making the necessary adjustment.
So the Chinese growth miracle from the 1980s to the 2010s was as you said, an investment driven model, which meant building a lot of infrastructure and building a lot of buildings, but that resulted in a property bubble that the Chinese government ultimately decided was not good for the country. So they're trying to grow the economy without having a real estate bubble, by lowering the investment in construction and building. And GDP, gross domestic product, economic growth, is, just for our audience, investment plus consumption plus the government plus net exports. So if it's a positive if China exports as it does more than it imports, and it's a minus for the U.S. We import more than we export for GDP. So China can either, if investment falls in China, or the rate of growth of investment falls in China, it can either have the total GDP go down, total growth rate of GDP go down, which it does not want. It could have consumption go up, which it desperately wants, but as you have pointed out, is very difficult. Or it does have this third toggle of it could just export more to the rest of the world, which China has been doing for decades. Right. But are you saying it's increased that pace to another level?
Yeah, the thing is that 96% of the growth in China, 95% is consumption and investment. And that's true in most countries. It's mostly consumption and investment. Net exports, the trade surplus, is an additional form of demand, but it's too small really to drive the Chinese economy. Although I have to say that this year it was a very important component of overall growth. But ultimately, a country as large as China cannot depend on net exports to drive growth. So they're stuck. It's either investment or consumption. And as you pointed out, they would love to raise consumption, but it's incredibly difficult to do so. So they have to keep investment growth rates very high if they want to achieve the high GDP growth target.
And why is it so hard to increase consumption in China as a percentage of GDP? From coming from Americans' perspective, it's quite easy. Just give people money, either send people checks from the government or have their credit card. People, Americans spend a lot of money. Now, maybe that is consequence of the rest of the world, but conceptually, it sounds a lot easier to drive consumption growth than investment growth. But in China, maybe it's the opposite. Why is that?
Yeah, you would think so because everybody likes to consume. Give them money, they're not going to complain. So there are different ways you could boost consumption. You could boost it temporarily in the short term by having government borrow. Chinese academics are recommending anywhere between 1 trillion and 3 trillion renminbi. 3 trillion would be about 2% of China's GDP. And they're recommending that the government borrow that and distribute it directly or indirectly to the household sector. Many ways of doing it. That would work. The problem is that if you're trying to address the debt problem, then resolving consumption by increasing debt is unsustainable. You can do it a couple of times, but you can't do it forever. The real way to increase the consumption share of GDP is to increase the household income share. So basically, one of the ways you can divide the economy is you can say all of GDP goes either to households, and households, you can say the rich and ordinary, or to foreigners, but foreigners are too small to matter, so you can ignore them, or to businesses, or to the government. And government in China, there are two governments. There's Beijing and there are the local governments. So when you talk about increasing sustainably the consumption share of GDP, you're talking about increasing the household share of GDP. But here's the problem. If my share goes up, by definition, your share must go down. It's easy to figure out how to get me a higher share. The hard part is figuring out how do you allocate the cost of that higher share, or to put it more bluntly, which sector of the economy pays for that. Basically, it's going to be businesses, probably not a good idea because businesses are the engine of economic growth, or the local governments or Beijing. And that becomes part of a conflict within China between Beijing and the local governments over the distribution of power. Now, one of the things that you have to remember is that this is not a Chinese problem. We've seen this before. Japan had a similar problem, not to the extent that China did, but in the 1980s, it faced many of the same imbalances. And in 1986, Japan issued something called the Maekawa Commission Report, in which they said all the things that they had to do: raise the consumption share of GDP, raise the household income share, reduce investment, reduce the reliance on the trade surplus, all the right things. And yet, here we are 38 years later, and it's still an open question as to whether or not Japan has finally pulled it off. And what that should tell us is that it's remarkably difficult to rebalance the economy. The quick way to do it, the way the US did it in the 1930s, for example, is with a really brutal contraction and a financial crisis. Clearly, China doesn't want to do that. The alternative has been, the historical precedent suggests it's very difficult to do so. And here's one possible reason I would suggest, and that is Chinese manufacturing is globally incredibly competitive. Now, you'll often hear that it's competitive because manufacturers are especially efficient, et cetera, et cetera. And no, that's not really true. It's competitive because there have been a whole series of transfers, direct transfers, restrictions on wage growth, very low interest rates, which benefit borrowers at the expense of savers, an undervalued currency, which benefits manufacturers at the expense of households. All of these things have subsidized the manufacturing sector in China at the expense of the household sector. So the part that I think many people don't realize is Chinese manufacturing competitiveness is not a separate thing from China's very weak domestic demand, from its very low consumption share of GDP. One is the obverse of the other. It's because of these transfers from the household sector to the manufacturing sector and to the government sector that investment is so high and that manufacturing is so competitive. But it's also because of these transfers that the household share of GDP is so low and consumption is so low. So if you want to solve the problem, you have to reverse the transfers. But if you do, what happens to a manufacturing sector that's for the last 20 to 30 years been built around these transfers? Presumably, they become much less competitive and they start losing market share and closing down. That's always the problem. And it's compounded by the fact that when you have this kind of growth model, you tend to have a very high manufacturing share of GDP, right? So you look at Japan at its peak, it was about manufacturing was about 27% of the Japanese economy. In China, it's about 28% of the Chinese economy. Globally, it's around 15% of the global economy. It's 11% of the US economy. Not surprisingly, manufacturing migrated from countries in which manufacturers were forced to subsidize consumers to countries in which consumers were forced to subsidize manufacture. And so that created a bit of an Achilles heel because manufacturing is so important to the Chinese economy that if you undermine it, it could have pretty adverse consequences in the short term, even though it would be positive in the long term. So I would argue that that's why it's so difficult to rebalance the economy. It's not about giving households more money. It's about taking resources from some sector of the economy and passing them on to the household sector. And it's the taking part that's so hard.
So the reason that Chinese manufacturing is so competitive, why they can produce goods that are so cheap, cheaper than the rest of the world, has a lot to do with what you're saying is it has a lot to do with why the reason Chinese consumption and demand is so weak. So if China wanted to boost consumption, that could come at the expense of its export-driven model of its
That's
very
right.
strong and competitive manufacturing. So it appears that Beijing is at a crossroads. Does it stimulate domestic demand at the expense of its export manufacturers, or does it continue to subsidize via all the policies you mentioned its export manufacturers? How is the Chinese Communist Party and Xi looking at that dilemma?
It's very hard to know what people in Zhongnanhai are thinking. It's very hard to get information from them. But when you speak to economists in China, including a number of people who have been or are policy advisors, I think there's a widespread recognition of how difficult this problem is. So there have been many proposals about ways to boost consumption. The problem is they all try to do it on the cheap. So, for example, people say, if you have a car, I will give you $100 if you turn in that car for a new model that costs $1,000. Obviously, cars don't cost $1,000, but I'm trying to keep the numbers simple.
Hey, in China, they're getting pretty competitive with BYD. The
Well,
cars,
yeah, at some point they're probably going to reach $1,000. But the argument there is that for $100 transfer, we can increase consumption by $1,000. Great, what a great program. But of course, that's not true. If you weren't going to buy a car, and because of this $100 subsidy that I'm giving you, you go out and buy a $1,000 car, you still have a budget constraint, right? You still make a certain amount of money and you have to spend within your budget. So you spend more than expected on cars, $900 more in this case. You'll probably spend $900 less on haircuts or restaurant meals or shoes or whatever. So your total consumption will go up roughly by the $100 subsidy, not by the amount of car purchases. And so they're learning that that's not working. There have been a lot of these small consumer subsidies that have had almost no impact. In fact, this year, consumption grew more slowly than GDP, in spite of all of this talk about boosting consumption. So my guess is, and I should state that Most analysts disagree with me, although 3 months ago, I think they disagreed even more. But my guess is that probably in the third quarter or early in the fourth quarter, they're going to do something that they said they wouldn't do, which is to engineer a large fiscal borrowing and use the proceeds to transfer to the household sector. That will boost consumption in the short term. That'll be great for business investment. When you talk to Chinese businesses, they'll tell you straight out the problem is there's no domestic demand. The only thing is that it's not a sustainable solution. It's a temporary solution. But I think we're going to start moving in that direction.
So the Chinese stimulus so far has not been like what the US did in 2020 and 2021 of just sending people checks in the mail, no questions asked. It's if you want to buy a car, you'll get a credit. It's
Right.
very conditional. Professor, I read a year ago or a few months ago, China was selling government bonds, including very long duration government bonds. What did China plan on doing with that money? Was it not stimulus and they were just issuing bonds for other reasons?
Well, total debt is continuing to rise, and part of the reason Beijing has been issuing bonds is to help get over disruptive adjustments at the local government level. You have to remember that a very large number of local governments, some might say the majority, are unable to service their debt. So they face a problem because if they can't service the debt, that puts enormous pressure on the banking system, which would then have to be bailed out. So one of the ways of dealing with that is temporary borrowings, or I should say, occasional borrowings by Beijing, which are then transferred to local governments to help them service debt as they try to work out their problems. We might hear during the third plenum, which is taking place as we speak, that they will restructure some of this debt to remove pressure on local governments, et cetera. But basically, local governments cannot service their debt. So Beijing needs to figure out ways of preventing a disruptive financial adjustment.
Earlier, you referenced Japan, which, like China, had an investment-driven growth model, which peaked into a financial bubble that peaked in the early 1990s. And there was a very long period of very slow growth, a recession, and real estate prices collapsed over a very long period of time in Japan. I believe when we spoke last year, that was your base case. You thought that China would really struggle to move from an investment driven model to a consumption driven model, and that what we saw in Japan over the past 30 years might be a blueprint for China. Is that still your base case?
Yeah, and I think by now it's almost a cliche. Sort of everybody is talking about the Japanese model of adjustment as what is likely to happen in the case of China. And so, yeah, it continues to be the base case. China could escape the Japan trap if it were to engineer significant transfers from local governments to the household sector. For example, I did a very simple model, and if you can transfer about 1 to 1.5 percentage points of GDP every year from local governments to the household sector, you might be able to get consumption to grow at 5, 6, 7%, in which case you could get GDP to grow at 3 or 4%, and for the economy to adjust substantially. Many people say that's impossible because local governments are bankrupt, but local governments are not bankrupt. They're unable to service their debt because they have severe cash flow problems, but they own tons of assets. So that's, in theory, a way China can escape the Japan trap. There's no evidence so far that they're going to do it, but otherwise, I think, the options are either a long, slow adjustment or, God forbid, a very rapid, brutal adjustment.
Thank you. And Professor, how does this have to do with the United States, Europe, and the rest of the Western economies, which have a much smaller share of manufacturing as a percentage of GDP and tend to consume a lot more? How does everything we've been talking about going in China impact the US as well as political decisions that the US faces?
I know it's politically very popular to attribute most of these problems to China, but China is not the only country that is exporting its domestic demand deficiencies. Japan is, although to a much lesser extent than in the past. Germany is. South Korea, a number of other countries are. That puts a particular burden on the United States because, as you know, the US absorbs roughly half of all the trade surpluses in the world. And that's necessary if these, I'm sorry, roughly half the trade surpluses through an enormous trade deficit. And the US trade deficit is necessary if the surplus countries are going to maintain their surpluses. Now, what seems to be happening, it began under Trump and it continued under Biden, and no matter who wins in November, it'll probably continue, is that the US is making really major efforts to sort of rebalance its own economy, to end its role of the great absorber of last resort, of global excess savings, or consumer of last resort. It's the same thing. Now, if it does that, that puts enormous pressure on the rest of the world. And the European Union in particular is very worried about this. Because if the US reduces its absorption of excess production globally, not just Chinese, but global, and by the way, so far the US isn't, the US deficit's actually growing, but if it succeeds in capping its deficit and bringing it down, then that means that surplus countries are going to be forced to redirect their surpluses into other large economies. And basically, what are the large economies? There's the EU, there's India, which has made it very clear it's not going to accept Chinese manufacturing, Japan, which also is determined to protect its manufacturing sector, and then the developing world. Each of those areas are now very focused on what the US does, because if the US takes steps to reduce its deficit, then that puts tremendously painful pressure on the surplus countries, or it forces the rest of the world to absorb the costs that the US has been absorbing. What I try to remind people is that this is nothing new. Back in the 1930s, we saw the same process. The famous British economist Joan Robinson wrote about it. She coined the phrase beggar thy neighbor. She actually coined beggar my neighbor, but it became beggar thy neighbor as a way of describing this process. If you have weak domestic demand and you have to resolve it domestically, and you can't raise demand quickly enough, then you have to reduce supply, which means a rise in unemployment. The alternative is to run trade surpluses. So she called it exporting unemployment. And basically, that's what we are. Surplus countries are exporting unemployment, and deficit countries have to respond either with higher unemployment or higher debt. And of course, nobody wants to do that. The US has played the key role there. And if the US starts withdrawing from that world, it creates a real global imbalance problem.
Forward Guidance is brought to you by VanEck. The VanEck Morningstar-wide Moat ETF, ticker MOAT, has outperformed the S&P 500 for over a decade. How? Moat strives to achieve a simple but challenging task: buy quality stocks when they're undervalued and sell them when they're overvalued. Visit vaneck.com/moatfg to learn more. That's vaneck.com/moatfg. Now the disclosures. All investing is subject to risk, including the possible loss of money you invest. Visit vaneck.com to carefully read a prospectus before investing. The VanEck Morningstar-wide Moat ETF is distributed by VanEck Securities Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of VanEck Associates Corporation. Thanks. Let's get back to the interview. And so the common understanding of why the US has such a large amount of government debt is because the government wants to spend. We don't want to tighten our belts. We just have very large fiscal deficits. You're saying that the fiscal deficits, that is, say, the capital inflows that the US experiences, are the direct result of trade deficits with the rest of the world, particularly China, and that China's trade surplus with the US is America's capital surplus with the US. In other words, America imports a lot more than it exports, and that difference is flooded back into the US through the capital account, through the US financial markets, which are very open to the rest of the world.
Yeah, this is so much easier to explain to non-Americans than to Americans. And I think the reason is because to be a little, a little irreverent here. There are broadly, I would argue, three groups of Americans, right? One large group of Americans believe that everything good that happens in the US and in the world is the direct result of American policy decisions. Another very large group, the opposite group, believes that every bad thing in the US and the world is driven by American policy decisions. And then there's a very small group, which includes people like me, that argue actually a lot of things happen that are not caused by the United States. The rest of the world does have agency. The US is 5% of global population and 23% of global GDP. The rest of the world does matter. And I think that's something very hard for people to understand. So when money flows into the US, the American-centric view says money must flow into the US because US savings are low and we need to import foreign capital to finance our very large trade deficit. And that's certainly one way of looking at it. But, before I moved to China, I ran trading and capital markets desks on Wall Street. And I can tell you, if you spend a lot of time in the markets, that a Scottish investment fund, the manager of a Scottish investment fund doesn't wake up in the morning and pick up the newspaper and say, oh my dear, the Americans their savings rate has gone down. I better invest some money in the US to help them out. That's not what happens. Foreigners decide completely independently why they're going to invest in the US and how much they're going to invest in the US. And the problem is because the balance of payments always balances, whether Americans need foreign capital and pull it in, or whether foreigners need to invest in the US and push it in either case, you're going to see a balance between savings and investment. The US economy will have a gap between savings and investment. If money comes into the US, by definition, American investment is higher than American savings. So if you believe that foreigners invest in the US because, they're smuggling drug money, they're investing central bank reserves, they're diversifying their savings, they're speculating on debt, whatever the reasons are, then what has to happen is that we have to see a gap between American savings and American investment. By definition, investment must be higher than savings. So what happens when foreign money comes into the US? Does investment go up or does savings go down? We don't know, so we have to look at other evidence. And what I would argue is that there have been periods in American history, like the 19th century, when Americans wanted to invest more than they could afford to out of their own savings. So when foreign capital came into the US, American investment went up. But that's no longer the case. American businesses aren't yelling, we desperately want to invest, but we simply can't access cheap enough capital. On the contrary, American businesses are sitting on huge pools of cash, which they're not investing. And when they do invest it, it's not investing, it's buying back their own shares or buying shares in other companies. Clearly, American businesses don't believe they need to increase investment. So that means when foreign money comes into the US, American investment is unlikely to go up. And you can look at the data, it doesn't. But you still must see the gap. And so the gap is generally created by a reduction in US savings. And I don't want to, go through a long pedantic thing. It's in my last book if anyone's interested. But there are generally three ways savings will go down. One way is because the inflows are the obverse of a US trade deficit, is that American manufacturers sell less to Americans because they're buying more from foreigners, and so they fire workers, in which case unemployment goes up. And as you know, an unemployed worker has a negative savings rate. So that's what causes American savings to go down. Now, of course, Washington doesn't like that to happen. So there are broadly two ways they can respond. One, the Fed, worried about rising unemployment, can lower interest rates to encourage American households to borrow and to consume. Borrowing is negative savings. So when Americans borrow to consume, the savings rate goes down that way instead of by an increase in unemployment. And then the third main way is that Washington can decide to expand the fiscal deficit in order to prevent unemployment from going up. And the fiscal deficit, of course, is negative savings. So once again, the US adjusts. So what I would argue is that because of these inflows into the US, and by the way, it's not just a US problem. We saw this in Spain, Italy, and Greece at the beginning of this century. German inflows had exactly the same impact. Those countries had to respond, like the US, either with higher unemployment, higher household debt, or a higher fiscal deficit. And not surprisingly, it generally chooses higher household debt or higher fiscal deficit. So the argument that the US runs a current account deficit because it has a high fiscal deficit has it backwards. That can be true under certain conditions. But when you enumerate those conditions, you quickly see that cannot be the case today in the US. So the causality is backwards. Capital inflows into the US force the US to choose among these options, and often enough, it will choose a higher fiscal deficit. If it lowers the fiscal deficit, that won't lower the trade deficit, because to lower the trade deficit, it would have to lower net capital inflows into the US. And most people would tell you that if the US fiscal deficit goes down, even more foreign money will flow into the US. So the trade deficit will actually widen, not contract. What will happen if you reduce the fiscal deficit is either you have to replace it with more household debt, or you have to let unemployment rise. And that puts the US, I would argue, in a very tough position. And it's why I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have been so determined to change those dynamics.
Yeah, so 20 years ago, I think a lot of economists, definitely the mainstream opinion, would not have agreed with a lot of what you're saying. There was a consensus that trade is always good. As I learned in Economics 101, if I make shoes and you make fish, you're great at making fish, I'm great at making shoes, and we trade. It's a net benefit, and that
Let me
philosophy.
interrupt you there, Jack.
Yes,
You're
yes.
absolutely right on the condition that you exchange your extra shoes for my extra fish, right? In other words, if the reason you export is to import, trade is almost unquestionably good. There can be problems with the division of the benefits, but generally global GDP goes up. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that you are trading shoes, but you are not importing fish. So all that's happened is that my fish production hasn't gone up, but my shoe production has gone down. That's all that's happened. In other words, that kind of trade suppresses global growth. It doesn't increase global growth. So we have to be very careful. Trade is good under one set of conditions, but it can suppress growth under another. And by the way, I didn't invent this. I wish I did, but we've known this for a long time. John Maynard Keynes explained it. Hobson explained it. John Hobson at the end of the 19th century. The American economist Charles Arthur Conant explained it at the end of the 19th century. We've known this for a long time. It's just in that weird phase of economics from the 1960s until the present. We've forgotten all of that stuff.
And from the 1960s to the present, this idea that trade is always good, regardless of if countries are running very large deficits, that was the main view. And since then, U.S. manufacturing employment has gone down a lot as things are no longer built in America. They are built elsewhere. So it peaked at 20 million people worked in manufacturing in 1980. It bottomed in 2009 at 11 million. Now it's closer to 13 million. So employment in manufacturing has gone up. As a percentage of the labor force, maybe it still is lower. But how did we find ourselves, Michael, where the tide is turning? And I might say, former President Trump, with his election in 2015, is talking about how China is killing us on trade. he definitely played a role. And the Democrats and Biden responded in turn. Like, I think it is now something of a consensus among Democrats and Republicans that to let China and let other countries just so-called dump products with no tariffs whatsoever, with no protection whatsoever, is not always the best solution. So just take us through that transition.
Well, the key thing is what the purpose of exports are. So you remember when you read in school about comparative advantage. In fact, you were giving me the comparative advantage argument. You could be better in producing both fish and shoes, but better than me. But if the gap in shoes is greater than the gap in fish production, then basically you should produce shoes and I should produce fish, and we should use our excess to exchange. In that case, you're producing more shoes than you need precisely because you want to import the fish that you need, and I'm producing more fish than I need because I want to import the shoes that you need. And in that case, comparative advantage shifts production to where it's most efficient, and so presumably total global production goes up, right? That's in a world without trade imbalances, because comparative advantage can only be expressed in the exchange of goods, not in the production. If all you do is produce shoes, that's not comparative advantage. You have to produce them against my fish production, and it's in the exchange that we realize the value of comparative advantage. But in our world, and in the world of the 1930s, that's not what happened. What happened is that in order to boost employment, certain countries subsidized manufacturing so that it would grow more quickly than otherwise. But because those subsidies came at the expense of the household sector, it reduced demand. So instead of being efficient exporters, which means that you get more and more imports for every unit of exports, they became exporters of weak domestic demand. I export not because I want to import, I export because I can't sell the stuff at home. And that's a very, very different environment. And as I said, that forces your weak domestic demand, which should cause a rise in unemployment at home. It forces that weak domestic demand onto your trade partners. So now your trade partners deal with the options of rising unemployment, rising household debt, or a rising fiscal deficit. It's a way of getting rid of that problem. But what it does, and Keynes was very explicit about this at Bretton Woods in 1944, what it does is it puts permanent downward pressure on demand. Because normally in a well-functioning world, you may temporarily have a surplus and I may temporarily have a deficit. But the deficit causes a contraction in my economy until I adjust, and your surplus causes an expansion in your economy until you adjust. But Keynes said when governments prevent the expansion in the surplus economy, then all you get is the contraction in the deficit economy. So that kind of trade is always putting downward pressure on demand. And the only way to resolve it is with rising debt. The other type of trade puts upward pressure on supply, and so demand follows. That's the big difference between these two types of trades. Now, I know this gets a little bit complicated, but did what I say make sense, or do I need to try to explain part of it again?
Some of it went over my head, but I think if I replay it and our audience replays it, I think you did explain yourself clearly. So I think it makes sense for me to ask my follow-up question, which is, under the economic orthodoxy, which I was taught, probably you were taught, that ran from the 1960s until now, there's basically the idea that tariffs are always bad. A tariff being, if Japan wants to export shoes, let's say to the US, the government is going to collect a 10% fee of the total amount sold, and that will make Japanese goods slightly less competitive. Back in the day, the U.S. government funded itself mainly on tariffs in the 1800s and the like. So there was the idea that was always bad because, I had to remember the economic term, it would cause deadweight loss. That is, all of the great competitiveness of the Japanese shoe manufacturers, they wouldn't be able to sell their goods, and then that would just be bad for the economy. It sounds like you have are on different school of thoughts. How might do you disagree with the view, which up until recently has been the economic orthodoxy, that tariffs are always bad? Is there a case that tariffs, such as the type that President Biden has been slapping on China, actually not only maybe good politically for the U.S. in terms of they have not that they'll help anyone get elected, but that they have societally advantageous effects, but that they might even enhance global growth in total?
The very fact that you mention economic orthodoxy sort of suggests what the problem is, right? The idea that tariffs are bad or tariffs are good, deficits are bad, deficits are good, inequality is bad, inequality is good, that belongs in the category of religion. In economics, all of those things can be good or bad depending on the underlying conditions, and we have to specify the underlying conditions. Now, if we have a well-functioning world of comparative advantage where every country specializes in its comparative advantage and exports in order to imports, then anything that interrupts that reduces total value. It becomes a deadweight cost, right? So if we lived in that world, I would say tariffs are a terrible idea. They might be a good idea in the short term to give you, for you to develop comparative advantage in a strategically important industry. But in that case, what benefits you comes at a cost to the rest of the world. Generally, for the world, tariffs are a bad idea. But we clearly don't live in that world. And one of the ways of thinking about it is tariffs work the same way currency depreciation works, the same way artificially repressing interest rates or artificially repressing wages. They all work basically the same way, overspending on transportation infrastructure. In every case, what they do is they transfer income, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, from households to manufacturers. So tariffs hurt importers and help exporters. All households are importers, and all exporters are the tradable goods sector, the manufacturing sector. So the way tariff work is it transfers income from households to subsidize manufacturers. That's the way a depreciating currency works too. When you depreciate the currency, you hurt importers, you help exporters in exactly the same way. When you lower interest rates in an economy in which only manufacturers can borrow, which was the case in China for a long time, you're transferring income from the household sector to subsidize the manufacturing sector. These all do the same thing. Now, let's say we live in a world of equilibrium, and then one country decides to break that equilibrium by forcibly depreciating its exchange rate in order to gain a trading advantage over the rest of the world. And let's say the rest of the world says, no, we're going to impose tariffs, or we're going to force our currencies down against you. We're going to reverse the impact of your depreciation. In that case, the first trade intervention made the trading system suboptimal, and the second trading intervention returned it to its original equilibrium, right? This is a very abstract example, but my point is that it's impossible to say that tariffs are always bad for trade. It depends on the conditions, the underlying conditions. So in the 1930s, when one country depreciated its currency by depreciating against gold, all the other countries did the same thing. And to say that their intervention was bad for trade is silly. It was the first intervention that was bad for trade, and the second set of interventions that tried to return to the original equilibrium. So, to me, whenever an economist says tariffs are bad, I think, this guy is a priest, not an economist. Tariffs can't be bad except under one set of conditions. They can be good under a different set of conditions. By the way, the whole idea of infant industry, which the U.S. exploited to a tremendous extent, was invented by an American, by Alexander Hamilton. We've done it in the past, and it's been pretty good for the economy under many conditions. Under some conditions, it's been bad for the economy. And what we should be doing is thinking about, when does trade intervention help? When does trade intervention hurt? And to say that it always hurts, that's just silly. That makes no sense.
And so, what was the name of the thing invented by Alexander Hamilton? Infant
The
what?
infant industry argument.
Okay.
He called it something different, the infant manufacturing or the infant producer or something like that. But it's basically the infant industry. Sometimes you need to protect an industry to the point where it develops a comparative advantage, and then you stop protecting it.
Hello, everyone. Permissionless 3 is coming to Salt Lake City on October 9th. The event for crypto natives is heading west, and we are bringing the biggest names in crypto together for an insane, can't-miss event. Hear from more than 200 industry titans, including Balaji, Mike Novogratz, and Dan Tapiero. The conversations at Permissionless will be covering the hottest themes in crypto, including modularity, restaking, the Bitcoin and Solana ecosystems, AI and crypto, rollups and L2s, institutional adoption, and of course the November election that will be right around the corner. We couldn't be more excited about this event. Get your ticket today and make sure I get some bragging rights by using my code FG10 to get 10% off. That's FG10, stands for Forward Guidance. I want to see you there. Do it. It's going to be at one of the most beautiful places in the United States, and everyone's going to be there. Van Spencer's going to be there. Jim Bianco's going to be there. Jan VanEck's going to be there. So what are you waiting for? Get your tickets now by clicking the link in the description and use code FG10. Back to the episode. What is China doing now to subsidize and assist its manufacturers and that result in the very large trade surplus that China has with the rest of the world, particularly the United States? Earlier, you mentioned a few things: direct transfers, restrictions on wage growth, low interest rates, and currency devaluation. Tell us about that, and how can America, or what is America doing to counteract those measures? What is the U.S. industrial policy? What does that mean?
Well, one of the big debates in the US, and again, I don't want to make this about China because it's not just China. There are a number of other countries that are doing it. But one of the big debates that we're having in the US, and we've been having this for over 200 years, is whether or not industrial policy works. And you'll often hear people say industrial policy consists of coddling inefficient industries. That's simply not true. Industrial policy in the US has a very long, successful history. The airline industry in the 1920s, I can go on and on. An awful lot of US manufacturing came out of industrial policy. But the point that I would make, and I have a piece coming out tomorrow on the Carnegie website that makes this point, is that the US doesn't get to decide whether or not its economy is subject to industrial policy. It gets to decide whether that industrial policy is designed in Washington or whether it's designed in Beijing, Berlin, Moscow, Riyadh, wherever, in the surplus countries. And I say that because in a globalized world, in a hyper-globalized world, there is no way, unless you control your trade and capital account, there is no way that policies in one country won't affect policies in your country. To take a very simple and obvious example, let's assume there are only 2 countries in the world to make life easy. And to make it less politicized, let's call them the US and Japan. And everything is in equilibrium. And then the Japanese decide to improve their international competitiveness by depreciating the yen. Now, many people will think that's a domestic policy. How does it work? A lower yen raises the cost of imports, so it penalizes importers. Households are all net importers. And it subsidizes exporters. The manufacturing sector is an export. So by depreciating its yen, Japanese industrial policy was designed to expand manufacturing at the expense of domestic demand. But it doesn't end there, because the yen dollar is not a Japanese internal condition. It's also an American condition. So to the extent that Japan depreciates the yen, it is also appreciating the dollar. So now the US, whether it wants to or not, is doing the exact opposite of what Japan did. It is subsidizing its household sector, it's subsidizing its consumers at the expense of its producers. So notice what happened. An industrial policy in Japan automatically caused the obverse industrial policy in the US. And this can happen in many ways. The only requirement you need for this to work is that global trade must balance, and we know that it balances. So anything that causes the manufacturing sector in Japan to expand, or the manufacturing of a particular type of product, let's say electric vehicles, to expand, because total demand is unchanged. In fact, it's actually gone down given the way Japan caused the expansion in the manufacturing sector. That means manufacturing must contract in the trade partner, in this case, in the US. And we see that all the time. If you line up the 10 largest advanced economies by trade balance, what you'll find is that all the surplus countries, the manufacturing sector as a share of GDP is higher than the global average. And all the trade deficit countries, the manufacturing sector as a share of GDP is lower than the global average. And that shouldn't surprise us. When the surplus countries put into place industrial policies specifically designed to expand their share of global manufacturing, then that share must come from somewhere, and there is automatically a contraction in the global share in the deficit countries. So what I would argue is that this whole discussion about whether the US should impose industrial policies, whether that's good for the economy or bad for the economy, is quite silly for two reasons. Reason number one, again, the idea that industrial policy is good or bad is not economics, it's a form of religion. It's good under certain specified conditions, it's bad under other specified conditions. We should be trying to specify those conditions. Problem number one. But problem number two is that the US is affected by industrial policy. It's just affected by, in my example, industrial policy in Japan. Japan has decided that for whatever reason it wants to do X, and that means automatically the US does the opposite of X, whether it wants to or not. So I would argue that the real debate in the US should not be, industrial policy a gift of God or a gift of Satan, but rather, is the US economy subject to the type of industrial policies that we would choose? And if not, then we have to at the very least reverse them, and at most move into the type of industrial policies we would choose.
So if the US thinks that it has no industrial policy, it really is subject to the industrial policies of other countries. If Japan has a very competitive sector and is subsidizing exports and has a very cheap local currency, then the US, that's the US's industrial policy.
Yeah.
It would be the same as if the US was trying to promote a stronger dollar. It's just Japan is doing it instead. So in that piece that you have coming out soon, which we will link and which will be live by the time this interview airs, I believe you talk about 3 different things that policymakers can do. The first one, I'll just give a spoiler, is nothing, and that is what is called free trade and what has reigned for 30 to 40 years in the US. Right. So tell us about those 3 options.
So one, you can do nothing, which is basically what we've done. And you can call it the free trade or the free market option. It's not. It means the US economy is distorted by policies not designed in the US, but designed abroad. And so you don't really change anything. And one of the consequences will be a continuing decline in the manufacturing share of the US economy. Option number 2 is to say that certain industries are very important to us, and we're going to support them with very explicit industrial policy. So we can decide electric vehicles are important, we can decide batteries are important, we can decide whatever, and support those industries. And in fact, to a certain extent, that's what the Biden administration has done very successfully, by the way. For me, the problem with that option is that as long as the rest of the world is able freely to export its savings into its excess savings into the US will continue running a trade deficit. So many people think about trade as an set of increments. So if we have a trade deficit, which includes imports of EVs, import fewer EVs, $100 fewer EVs, the trade deficit goes down by $100. That's not true at all. What determines the US trade deficit is the US capital account surplus, which is completely independent of whether or not the US imports EVs. So what will happen in that case is that the US will produce more EVs at home, but its overall manufacturing sector will continue to decline because it'll continue to run these large deficits. And the consequence is that the strategically important sector grows, but at the expense of overall manufacturing. The third option is to say, like China, like all these other countries, we refuse to play this accommodating role. We want to regain control of our capital account and our trade account, which is the same thing, in order to regain control of the domestic economy. And in that case, we figure out where is the pressure coming from. I would argue that what drives American imbalances is the capital inflow that then force the trade imbalance. So I would argue the most efficient way to do this is to attack the capital inflows directly, put a tax on them. Foreigners are saying we value American safe assets so much that we will do whatever. We'll buy them at a zero interest rate because we value the safety of these assets. This creates a cost for the American economy, and what the US economy can do is say we ship the cost back to you by taxing those inflows. And as you tax the inflows, you move it up and down until the capital account balances, in which case the current account will balance. When that happens, the US economy will be driven by domestic factors. It'll no longer be a hyper-globalized economy in which conditions are driven by external factors. So those are the three options. Do nothing and pretend that it's the free market. Support strategically important industries, but resign yourself to a gradual decline of your manufacturing sector, or refuse to play the accommodating role, the balancing role in the great global imbalances.
And so option one, do nothing, has been the status quo in the United States for 30 years. It may be the case that the US now is doing under Trump and now Biden option two of selective tariffs on selective goods. But you say that that won't be successful in increasing the manufacturing share of GDP. Why not? And why wouldn't just tariffs in general, in other words, restricting the movement of goods, trade, is not necessary to impact the level of manufacturing? Why do you have to have capital controls, which I believe we had in the, you referenced Bretton Woods in 1944. We had that until capital controls were loosened around time of the 1970s. But now China does have a capital control. So why does there have to be capital controls? In other words, why are tariffs doomed to fail to increase importers' manufacturing percentage of GDP?
It's not that they're doomed to fail. What's doomed to fail are bilateral tariffs, because the reason Germany, Japan, South Korea, China have trade surpluses is because savings exceeds investment. And if you put tariffs on one of those countries, even the biggest one, China, that's not going to change the savings investment imbalances in all of those countries. And as long as those countries can continue to invest those imbalances, the savings imbalances in the US will run a trade deficit. Its deficit with the country on which it imposed tariffs might go down. We saw that under Trump. The American deficit with China went down, but automatically the American deficit with the rest of the world went up. That has to happen unless you change the savings investment imbalances. The advantage of taxes on capital inflows is that you go directly to the problem. You say, we will not absorb your savings imbalances. Either find somebody else to absorb them, and nobody will, or resolve them domestically. Reduce your savings rate or increase your investment rate. And that will force a much more direct adjustment. Now, it's important to understand that if you put taxes on capital inflows, or if you put tariffs not on one country, but on all countries, they have exactly the same effect. But there's also a cosmetic difference. If you put tariffs, you will let loose incredible trade conflicts, retaliation, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem is it will seem that the cost of tariffs are being borne by consumers, right? If you put taxes on capital inflows, that becomes much less contentious because no country can criticize you for putting capital controls. Many countries have capital controls. And what's more, it's the financial system that pays the burden of the cost rather than consumers. So generally, I prefer taxes on capital inflows. I know that this used to be such a wild idea. I thought it would never be accepted. I'm surprised at how many people accept it now. And I think eventually that's the direction we're going to go in.
You think that foreigners putting money into the US will have to be controlled via capital controls and tax. And yeah, I can say maybe generally politically among all Americans, that would be much more popular than tariffs. But among the financial community, who are a lot of the listeners to the show, especially, I was just in Washington, D.C. yesterday in a large auditorium. I imagine a lot of the people there would not probably agree with you.
Wall Street will hate it. The
Yeah.
foreign affairs establishment won't be crazy about it either, because it would mean reducing the role of the dollar as the global supercurrency, which creates big problems for the US economy, but it's great for Wall Street and it's great for the imposition of American power abroad. So I think, there's no such thing as something that's universally good. But I think Americans should have a discussion about, do we want a policy that benefits businesses, workers, and the overall economy at the expense of our financial industry and maybe of our ability to exert power globally, which is more important, and then let that make the decision. But I guarantee you Wall Street will really oppose this idea.
Who of the two presidential candidates, President Biden and former President Trump, do you think would enact a higher tariff rates? Trump was really the first to increase tariffs when he got elected in 2016. Biden, I don't think, has rolled a lot of them back and has put some new tariffs in. I think there's a general view that Trump is harder on China, will increase tariffs more because he's brash and because he was the first presidential candidate to raise this issue. But if you look at, I think, what Biden's actually done, he has not gone back to the pre-Trump consensus. And I was speaking to a gentleman, an American who, like you, was in Beijing, and he said that actually some in the Chinese Communist Party might prefer Trump to be in office because they could negotiate with him, and he might be a little more quid pro quo if they say, oh, we're going to invest billions of dollars into a factory in Iowa. Trump will use that as a political victory, and that will satisfy him, whereas Biden and Biden's team may be less easy to negotiate with.
Those are politically sensitive topics, and I'd rather not discuss, differences between the Trump team and the Biden team. What I can say is that, if I could summarize it in a very easy way, senior people in the Biden administration have said, we prefer industrial policy, but we're very sympathetic to trade policy. And senior people in the Trump administration have said, we prefer trade policy, but we're very sympathetic to industrial policy. The point that I would make is that there is no meaningful distinction between trade policy or industrial policy. And ultimately, both groups seem to be pretty committed to changing the US role in the global imbalances.
Thank you. So, Michael, going into this interview, I thought that China's very difficult attempts to increase consumption as a percentage of GDP, it was, because it doesn't want to reduce growth, it was stimulating the exports channel. But you said that exports are only 5% of the Chinese economy. So is it that actually China wants to maintain its dominance in the investment-driven model, but instead of investing in real estate and infrastructure, it is investing in manufacturing, and then the competitiveness and the exports are only a result of that?
Yes,
Okay.
Exactly right. That's a residual. The growth in the trade surplus is a residual of this investment-driven low consumption model. because this model does two things. It makes exports more competitive and it reduces domestic demand. The inevitable result is a large and growing trade surplus.
Got it. And I guess the most conspicuous example of China's attempts to move from real estate investment to manufacturing investment is from its most recent GDP report, where real estate sales fell 25% year over year, but production of 3D printing devices, electric vehicles, and integrated circuits went up 52%, 34%, and 29% year over year. So the real estate sector continues to decline. The manufacturing sector continues to boom. What are your thoughts on that? And I mean, do you think will continue? Do you think that manufacturing can take the place that real estate used to?
Only if the rest of the world accommodates it, right? Because it requires a growing Chinese share of global manufacturing. In fact, if you do the calculations, they're quite easy to do. China's share of global manufacturing has to rise at roughly twice the rate of China's share of global GDP and at 3 to 4 times the rate of China's share of global consumption. So if China were a small economy, it wouldn't matter much to the rest of the world, but it's already 31% of total manufacturing. So the rest of the world has to be willing to accommodate that kind of shift. And whether it is or whether it isn't is still a bit of an open question. What I would say, when you look at the Chinese numbers, you should look at proxies for production versus proxies for consumption. And there, the most recent data that came out yesterday and last week are pretty depressing. So for example, one proxy for production is exports, and a proxy for consumption would be imports, right? And on Friday or Thursday, we were told that June's exports were up 8.6% year on year. We expected a big jump, but nowhere near that level. Imports, we expected a very weak 3% growth. In fact, imports dropped by 2.3%. Now, that may have been an exceptional month, but that gap is enormous. And that's what we're watching to understand the rebalancing process. Yesterday, we were told that industrial production, which is again a proxy for total production in China, was up, I believe, 5.3% in June, year on year. Retail sales, which is a proxy, a rough proxy, but a proxy for consumption, were expected to be up much less, around 3.3%. In fact, they were up 2%. Again, a huge gap between the growth in production and the growth in consumption. And this shows up either or both as an increase in domestic investment or an increase in the trade surplus. And in June, we had the highest monthly trade surplus in history, perhaps in the whole world. I don't think any country has ever run a $99 billion trade surplus in a single month. That's what we need to be watching. That's the gap that China has to close. And hopefully over the rest of this year, we'll see that gap narrow.
And the reason that China's moved from investment-driven growth in real estate and infrastructure to China's investment-driven growth in manufacturing, the reason that impacts the rest of the world, just to put a bow on this conversation, is because you can't export a building or a bridge, but you can export an electric vehicle, right, or something that you produce. So the U.S. policy, not just of tariffs, but of industrial policies such as Inflation Reduction Act, in giving tax breaks and incentives for companies for building in the U.S., does that have an impact on all exporters, not just China? For example, I've noticed that Germany's exports and Germany's economy, which like China's is export driven, has been quite weak. Is it that China is more competitive than Germany, so China actually can withstand the Inflation Reduction Act and industrial policy, but Germany and maybe some other exporters can't?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act may not have much of an impact on the overall deficit, right? To change that, you have to either change the savings investment imbalance in China, Germany, South Korea, and the rest of the world, or you have to change their ability to invest the excess savings in the US. And the IRA didn't do either of those things. But what it does seem to have done is it seems to have focused this very rapid expansion in Chinese auto manufacturing, not just EVs, but also internal combustion engines, uh, away from the US and into the rest of the world. And the most likely rest of the world is, of course, Europe. And I think that's why there's been so much concern in Europe about what the US has done. The general feeling in Europe is that both China and the US are very aggressively investing in expanding manufacturing capacity, and Europe is doing nothing. So it's going to take the brunt of that expansion.
Thank you. Michael, one of my final questions is about the Chinese banking system. The vast majority of the credit to the real estate sector, which is now imperiled, was not from capital markets or from other financing sources, but from banks, some of which are state owned, but they're publicly traded too. So there's definitely a private stake as well. How do you see this playing out? I mean, if this was in the US and so the ridiculously large sums of debt, $300 billion of Evergrande debt was, owned by JP Morgan, I think there would be some financial contagion effects. However, it is China, and there's the argument that China can manage this because they have a much more command control style of economy, and a lot of the banks have a considerable share of ownership by the government, which again has a very strong hand in this affair. Where do you stand in that argument? Do you have concerns about the Chinese banking system?
China is very unlikely to have a banking crisis. A crisis is caused by an asset liability mismatch. And although on paper there are huge asset liability mismatches in China, in the end, the regulators can restructure liabilities at will. So in practice, there's no asset liability mismatch. Again, Japan becomes an interesting way of thinking about this, because remember, after the 1990s, we talked about the zombification of the Japanese banking system. The banks didn't go under. I think it was 1997 before the first Citibank went under, and that was, I think, the smallest of the Citibanks. Um, uh, but until then, basically, you just had these large institutions struggling to maintain profitability with very little likelihood of a financial crisis. And I think that's even more true in China. I think a financial crisis is very unlikely. It's not impossible. Confidence matters and all these other things matter. But as long as the regulators are very credible, and they are, then I think a banking crisis is just very unlikely.
And so let's say, I'm not going to name names, just large Chinese bank A has $50 billion of loans to Evergrande, which is now defaulted, and the bank equity capitalization is $30 billion. So it has a capital hole of $20 billion, negative $20 billion of equity. What would China do? Would it write off the loan? Would it inject its own capital? Would that come from bond sales? Would that come from the People's Bank of China? How do these plates keep spinning?
What you would worry about is that depositors look at that negative equity number and say, last one out loses, so I'm taking my money out. But depositors in China assume, particularly with the big banks, that the deposits are guaranteed. And in fact, we've seen in cases of non-guaranteed deposits, for some small banks in Henan, for example, they defaulted on deposits that were very explicitly not guaranteed, and yet they were all fully paid out. So there's a perception in China that it's very hard to lose money if you've got your money in the banks, and the government will always bail you out, so you'll never have a bank run. And if you don't have a bank run, you can have negative equity for a long time. I always remind my students that when I started working, I worked for what was the fourth largest bank in America. It was called Manufacturers Hanover. And if you mark to market correctly, it was bankrupt. In fact, of the 10 largest banks in America, probably only JP Morgan wouldn't have been bankrupt. And yet there were no bank runs because of faith in the implicit or in the explicit deposit guarantee. So what really matters is if faith disappears and then you get a bank run. And I think that's very unlikely in China.
Do you have any concerns about the Chinese shadow banking systems? Like, for example, loan companies that make loans with money that they get from banks and then sell those loans back to the banks and then issue guarantees to banks. I don't know if that's that large in China, but a lot of those, my amateur reading of some of these companies They have very structured off-balance sheet arrangements that look similar to things I've seen from 2006, 2007 American banking, things that I don't really see anymore in America. Do you have any concerns there?
Yes and no. I'm concerned because a lot of that has been used to fund investment or spending that it would be really hard to call productive, which means that it created economic activity today, which will be removed in the future. So, as we saw in the case of Japan, many years of much lower growth to reverse all of that false growth. But if concerns, if by concerns you mean a crisis, no. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll notice that I rarely talk about the components of debt every month when the debt numbers come out. I just talk about the aggregate number because ultimately almost all of the debt in China, one way or another, goes through the banking system. So you can think about it as a single, very large bank with lots of wobbly pieces, but ultimately it's a single system. And you can get small defaults here and there in the corners, but basically you're not going to get major defaults on depositors. And as long as that doesn't happen, and as long as depositors believe that won't happen, then you won't see runs on the bank. By the way, there has been a lot of mergers and acquisitions, particularly of smaller banks. I don't know if you've noticed that. And that's something, several years ago I said was almost inevitable. Most people agree that China has too many banks, including too many small banks that did some pretty crazy stuff. And my guess is that over time, more and more of those banks will be merged into the larger banking system.
I actually didn't know that. Thank you for telling me about that. So your concern about China is not a financial crisis. It is structurally low growth as it moves away from its investment driven growth model. As Jay Powell said yesterday, quote a old phrase, predictions are hard, especially about the future. But I am going to now ask your prediction. How do you see this all playing out? Will China be successful in keeping its growth numbers high, either by boosting consumption? I feel like your answer there is no, or by moving towards a manufacturing driven model, not infrastructure driven model, in which case, as we've been talking about, that requires the rest of the world to absorb those excess capacity. Or will Western governments succeed in constraining China's exports, which would cause China to be lower growth?
Rather than make predictions, I prefer to try to think about it systemically. And so just work out the possible paths. And it's not so hard to do. If you assume that China cannot maintain, this share of investment of its GDP, which, by the way, no other country has ever done, that it has to bring it down, then you can make some simple assumptions. Let's say China has 10 years. I don't think it has, but let's just say 10 years to bring its investment share of GDP down by 10 percentage points, right? Which would still make it one of the highest investing countries in the world. So I think it'll have to come down by a lot more than that. But again, just to sort of box out the options, you can then easily work through the various assumptions. In order for that to happen, GDP growth depends on the growth rate of consumption. In my simple model, I said, let's pull a number out of the air. Let's say consumption grows at 7%. In that case, China's GDP will grow at 4%, and it will rebalance as we've defined it within 10 years. Now, consumption growing at 7% is really hard to imagine. Pre-COVID, it was growing at roughly 4%. So let's say it grows at 4%. In that case, GDP growth drops to around 2%, and China rebalances as we've defined. Maintaining consumption historically has been never the case. It always drops, either a little or a lot. So you can play with different levels of consumption growth. And what that does is it tells you what it requires for the rebalancing to take place. One of the variables you can work with is a growing trade surplus. And if you want a growing trade surplus to generate high levels of growth rate in China, basically you have to make crazy assumptions. Like, at some point, China's trade surplus is equal to 50% of global GDP. That's never going to happen. I don't know where the limit is. but it's probably not much greater than where it is now. And if that's the case, it's very hard for the trade surplus to generate a lot of growth. So I would say, the easiest thing is really to work out a simple model, make a couple of assumptions, and just see what does it take to get to different states. And you'll see they're quite difficult. The most likely case is much slower GDP growth and not too much slowing of the growth in household income and the growth in consumption, which is what happened in Japan, and which means, among other things, even if GDP growth drops a lot, you're not going to get popular unrest and popular unhappiness because consumption growth, household income growth will continue rising at a reasonable pace.
Professor, has the fall in real estate prices, does that negatively impact consumption because of the wealth effect? People feel less wealthy because their assets have declined in value?
Yes, but it's important to understand how the wealth effect works. Rising real estate prices doesn't make a country richer, and falling real estate prices doesn't make a country poorer. The wealth of a country, as Adam Smith told us a long time ago, is basically the value of goods and services it produces. So what matters in the long term is whether high prices or low prices generate more growth. And I think most of us would agree low real estate prices are better for the economy than high real estate prices. However, when real estate prices go up, certain groups get rich. The country doesn't get richer, but certain groups get rich. So by definition, other groups are getting poorer. And it's not hard to figure out who that is. Whoever's short real estate, young people, the unemployed, poor people, etc. When real estate prices go down, you get the reversal. China isn't getting poorer. What's happening is that there's a big shift of income from people who are long real estate to people who are short real estate, or a shift of wealth. Overall, there's been very little change in wealth. So does that matter to the economy? In the long term, it's probably good for the economy because generally the losers are richer than the winners. So you get a downward shifting of wealth and income, which is good for growth. But, to use a technical term, there's a convexity in the impact on spending. If my income goes up by $100 and your income goes down by $100, you might say nothing's happened. But in fact, you are probably going to cut your spending much more sharply than I raise my spending. It may take me a couple of years of higher income before I'm comfortable raising my consumption rate. So the problem there is that in the short term, a decline in real estate prices is bad for the economy because it reduces spending, even though in the longer term, assuming no hysteresis effects, it is probably net positive. So declining real estate prices in China are actually good for China. Prices were so high that it was completely distorting the economy. But in the short term, it's going to be painful. There's no way around that.
So that's the impact of the decline in Chinese real estate prices. What about the Chinese stock market, which I know from your work is nowhere near as big of a role in the Chinese economy as the stock market is in the U.S. However, Tencent, Alibaba, these very large companies, their market values have declined, and they are trading at historically cheap multiples. Some of them, or relative to history, as well as the foreign investment in China has dried up, either because self-imposed by investors or in some cases they are not allowed to invest, as in the case of semiconductors. Well, actually, I don't know if that's the stock market. I believe in our previous conversation, you said that the Chinese stock market trades based on sentiment and liquidity from the People's Bank of China, much less so on earnings. But at some point, the fundamentals do have to match up with the reality, right? If China is trading at, the stock market is trading at 1 times earnings, and you can get all of your money back in a year if they paid out dividends at 100%, which they don't, that would be a good investment, right?
Yeah, if you were certain that that was going to happen, it would make a lot of sense. In the long term, fundamentals always assert themselves. But in the short term, you can have prices driven by fundamentals or driven by speculation. And in China, it's a very, very speculative market. Now, does it matter? Beijing seems to think it matters because of its impact on confidence. When you see a rising stock market, you tend to be more confident. maybe you go out and, buy that a higher priced restaurant dinner or whatever, and that's good for the economy. But aside from the impact of confidence, it has very little impact on the Chinese economy because high stock prices don't mean a low cost of capital. Most Chinese companies get their financing through the banking system, not by issuing equity. So it has a very limited impact on the real economy. And it's small enough that it doesn't even affect spending that much. Its biggest impact may just be, window dressing as a bellwether. When it goes up, everybody may feel a little bit more confident about the future. And then when it goes down, that seems to reinforce whatever your nervousness about the future happens to be.
Mm. Got it. Well, Michael, thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I know my audience will as well. Be very generous with your time and insights, which I appreciate. You are the author of several books. The most recent book relative to what we're discussion about is Trade Wars or Class Wars. We'll link that in the description, as well as your piece, Which Country Should Design U.S. Industrial Policy, which should come out soon, as well as your piece in Phenomenal World, Trade and the Manufacturing Share. And of course, people can find you on Twitter at Michael X Pettis. Just let people know, where is your website and where can people find out more information?
My website, and I'm starting a new one in conjunction. The new one will be more occasional pieces. They're both at the Carnegie Endowment site. So if you go onto the Carnegie site, not Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Endowment, the think tank, you'll find both of them.
Thanks again, Professor.
Thank you, Jack.